Hey, today on Flipping Science, I'm introducing classification.
There are many different names for the animals you know. Scientists use special names so they can clearly show the genus and the species instead of every time naming kingdom, phylum, class, and order and family down the line. So the next time you're walking aimlessly.
So science understanding we're going to look at, biological classification is hierarchical and indicates the relationship between organisms based on physical structures and on molecular sequences. There is an internationally agreed system of nomenclature of species which undergoes revision. Distinguish between scientific names and common names, recognise that closely related species have similar scientific names, and discuss advantages of the internationally agreed system of nomenclature. So here's my first question. What would you call this luncheon meat? Now, the reason why this is interesting is that this luncheon meat has different names in different states in Australia. So in South Australia we call it Fritz or bung Fritz. But it's pretty much exactly the same as Devon, which is what it's referred to in, say, Victoria and New South Wales. If you're Italian, you might call it mortadella, which is a very similar, again, luncheon meat, made in a similar way. So this is one thing that has several different names just within Australia, and this is important when we talk about classification. So what is classification? Classification in biology, it's a system of sorting organisms into closely related groups. So you have large groups of organisms and you sort them out into smaller groups until you get down to just one species of organism. The way we establish relatedness is by looking at physical structures to start with, but these days it's much more common to look at the DNA and proteins found within the species to identify how closely related they are to other species. It's a hierarchy. The further down you go down the hierarchy, the fewer species you have and the more closely those species related to each other are. So we start with domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you have the largest number of organisms in a domain, and you have a few smaller number of organisms in a kingdom, then smaller in a phylum, smaller class, smaller, and so on. So the further down you go, the fewer species you have, but the more closely related those species are. An easy way to remember those levels of classification is dirty kings play chess or fight green slugs. That's one way of remembering it's a mnemonic. So relatedness can be established by looking at similarities in physical structures. So here we have several forearms, and all of these are chordates. We have mostly mammals, but we have one bird, which is aves or reptile. If we have a look, we have one big bone, two smaller bones, and then we have wrist bones and then fingers. We can see those structures repeated in reasonably closely related organisms. So if we have a look at our cat, for example, we have that big bone, two smaller bones, wrist bones, and then fingers. In this case, they have claws on the end. Now this would be a paw at the front, so the paw at the bottom on the foreleg of the cat, but those same structures are there. If we have a look at a bird and a bat, we can see that they have the same bones again. So we have one big bone, two small bones, then we have wrist bones, then we have fingers. The difference here is the fingers are very long, and that provides the flying structure for the bat, whereas in the bird, the wing is arranged differently. But because we have these structures that are similar, we can say that these organisms are closely related, or reasonably closely related. More commonly today, relatedness is established by analysing the DNA and proteins in different species. So DNA is a sequence. You can compare the sequences of two species, and if they are very similar, you would say those species are closely related. Proteins is very similar. So a protein is a sequence of amino acids. If you can compare, say, two large proteins and you have a look at the amino acid sequence, any differences in the amino acid sequence will, the more differences there are, the bigger the gap in relatedness between your two species. So if we have a look at down here an example, cytochrome C is a very important enzyme. It's related to releasing energy. If we compare humans to chimpanzees, there is no differences in our amino acid sequence, but if we compare humans to a fruit fly, there are 24 differences. So we are more closely related to a chimpanzee than we are to a fruit fly. Now we're going to look at some terminology. So many species have a common name. A common name is what they are referred to regularly in conversation. The issue with common names is that they're different between countries and even within a country, and this is where the Fritz thing comes up. So Fritz, mortadella, and Devon are all basically the same thing, but even within Australia we have three different names for it. By having one internationally recognised name, you mean that there's no confusion between scientists when they're referring to a name. So when we say a name, we know exactly what we're talking about. So this large cat down here, it has three common names. It can be called a puma, a mountain lion, or a cougar. These are common names, and depending on where you are in the US, you will refer to it as different names. But it's all the same species, it's all the same species of cat. So it has a scientific name, in this case Felis concolor, and that means whenever a scientist talks about Felis concolor, they're talking about pumas, mountain lions, and cougars, and every other scientist understands what they're talking about. There's no regional variation in the name. This name also gives us information about the species. So Felis is the genus, that is cats. So it is a cat. It is a species of cat. So by having a scientific name, we can avoid issues of having common names, which change depending on where you are in the world. This is all about nomenclature. Nomen means name, and clature is kind of organizing. So it's the naming of things and the organizing of things based on their names. So all species have a scientific name, which they're often referred to as, which is called a Latin binomial. Latin because it's normally in Latin, and bi means two, and nomo, again, name. So it's two names. And that's the genus and species, so that's those lower two levels of classification, and we call that the scientific name. So if I refer to Homo sapiens as a scientist, I'm referring to modern humans. If I refer to boa constrictor, I'm referring to one species of large snake. If I refer to Balaenoptera musculus, I'm referring to the blue whale. Important things to note, when you're typing out the name, it should be in italics. So the genus is in italics with a capital, and the species is in lowercase at the start and also in italics. But if you're writing it down, you write it down and you underline it. This is just rules that we have. The idea here is we have one name that is internationally recognized so that any scientist can talk about the species and any other scientist will understand what they're saying. So who decides on the names? It depends on what we're looking at. So we're going to focus on animals. For animals, there's an international group called the ICZN, it's the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature. It's the international body in charge, so you essentially lodge a name with them once you have written a scientific paper describing a new species, and then their classification is kept there, so then every other scientist can see how you've done their classification and that they're using the proper name. By having a huge international body, it means that there's only one international scientific name that's given to every single, in this case, animal species. There's similar groups for plants and fungi and bacteria, and also protists. So when I say Balaenoptera musculus, any other scientist in the world knows I'm talking about blue whales. These pictures here are blue whales that I've taken at various museums around the world. So this one is in New York, this one is in London, and this one's in Tokyo. It's interesting that large, important museums have a blue whale. I find that interesting. The names aren't necessarily set in stone. The classification isn't necessarily set in stone because when new information is uncovered, scientists change their mind. When we're talking about classification, this normally happens at the genus level, which is very, very low down in the classification system. A good example here is Banksia and Dryandra. So Dryandra and Banksia, they're originally in two different genuses in plants. But after looking at some more information and looking at some genetics, it was decided that they're not that distinct from each other to be in a separate genus. So now they're all in the genus Banksia. And this can sometimes happen at higher levels in classes, so aves for birds. Looking at the DNA of birds and comparing them to crocodiles, it was shown that the DNA of crocodiles and birds is more closely similar than crocodiles are to lizards and snakes. But we all agree that a crocodile and a lizard and a snake are reptiles. So if crocodiles are more closely related to birds, then that means that birds have to be classified as reptiles. Now, this is still disputed because some groups of scientists don't like to change things like this once they've done a lot of work on it. So birds should be, or possibly will be, moved into the reptilia, which is the name of the class of the reptiles. But currently, depending on where you look and what books you look at and what websites you look at, they might still be in their own class. So even though it makes sense to have them in the reptilia, it hasn't really changed over yet. The last thing we're going to look at is that we need to recognize that species that are closely related have very similar species names. And the reason for this is it reflects the evolutionary history. If we have a look, so we're looking at animals again, so we're going to compare some primates to some carnivores. If we have a look at the level of over here, so we've got, say, the panthers. So Panthera tigris is a tiger, Panthera leo is a lion. So the similarity in the name is at this genus level. Over here we have dogs, and again there's been revision over here with dogs. So dogs and wolves are the same species. So what's happened now is we've generated subspecies. So Canis lupus familiaris is the official name for dogs. Canis lupus lupus is the official name for wolves. So they are very similar in name because they are very closely related. Wolves and dogs can have babies with each other. Homo sapiens is us, so it means a smart human or smart man. Homo erectus is an extinct member of the Homo genus, but we have a lot of similarities with Homo erectus. So because we're closely related, we have a very similar name. So today on Flippin Science, I introduced classification. That's the Flippin Science today. See ya.